Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Fairfield University's Center for Catholic Studies Living Theology Workshop. My name is Paul Lakeland. I direct the Center for Catholic Studies. I'm happy to welcome you here. This is the third of the workshops that we have conducted this semester on different aspects of the thinking of Pope Francis, especially in his latest letter, Fratelli Tutti, which was published only last October. So some of you may be at your third of these three sessions. Some of you may only be here for the first time, but we have talked back in February, I think it was, about Pope Francis's understanding of the role of social media in our lives today. Last time in March, we talked about Pope Francis on neoliberalism and the global market economy. And today we're going to talk about two issues that he has particularly picked out in the later part of his letter to address very directly. One of them is the whole question of war and peace. And the second, even more specific, I suppose, is the issue of the death penalty. So shortly, I'm going to hand you over to my friend and colleague, Professor Kevin Cassidy from the Politics Department. Kevin has taught here for many years, ran the program in Peace and Justice Studies for many years, and is definitely an expert on these issues, and particularly an expert on the politics of Northern Ireland. So I've asked Kevin to talk shortly about the first of the two issues, of these two issues that the Pope specifically has picked on, that is the question of an appropriate Catholic approach anyway to the issues of war and peace. Before we turn to Kevin, let me just give you a little bit of background about well, not just about the letter, but this particular chapter as a whole, because these two issues only come up later in the chapter. So, you know, as I was thinking about this, two very familiar phrases came into my mind, at least familiar to people like me or my generation in the church. One of them was the phrase, I think it came from Pope Paul VI, if you want peace, work for justice. And the other phrase, which also may have come from Pope Paul VI, I don't remember at this point, was peace is not the mere absence of war. And these two ideas are very firmly seated in Catholic social teaching tradition, and I think two ideas that Pope Francis has rattling around at the back of his mind. But the letter as a whole is approaching many different issues. As I said, we talked about social media, we talked about capitalism. He's approaching all these issues from the perspective of seeking out what he calls social friendship, or what he sometimes calls political love. They're not common phrases, I think, and the idea he has behind them is that we have to find a way as individuals, as nations, as a global community to overcome our differences, to work together on common issues and common problems that threaten the livelihoods of all of us, and maybe to some degree threaten the life of the global community. He says at one point at the beginning of this chapter, he says, if only we could view our political opponents in the same way we view our children. And we might think, well, that's highly unlikely. But I think the point he's making is that we should want the best for our children as we do, and we should want the best for our political opponents. We should want them to live a healthy life in a healthy global community. So before I turn to Kevin, let me just read one very brief passage from the papal letter that leads directly into what Kevin and I will have to say. So this is what the Pope says it's in section 255 of the letter Fratelli Tutti. He says this: There are two extreme situations that may come to be seen as solutions in especially dramatic circumstances without realizing that they are false answers that do not resolve the problems they're meant to solve, and ultimately do no more than introduce new elements of destruction into the fabric of national and global society. These are war and the death penalty. Now, as you listen to Kevin and then later to me, and you think about these issues, if questions pop into your mind in this webinar format, we have this system where you can't really vocalize the questions as you would in a Zoom session, but you can go to the Q&A function on your screen, click on it, and you can type in a question there. It can be anonymous or you can put your name in, it doesn't matter. You can type the question in there just as soon as it pops into your head. You don't have to wait till the end. So please feel free to do that as we go along. And then when Kevin and I have spoken for a few minutes each, we'll take your questions and comments and have a conversation around them. So without any more ado, I hand over to Professor Kevin Cassidy.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. When Paul Lakeland asked me to join in this webinar format, he suggested I be talking about my background in teaching a course called Peace and War in the Nuclear Age, which was a course I gave with another faculty member on nuclear weapons. And it was during the 1980s and 90s when the Reagan administration was attempting to increase the weapons spending in the US, especially on nuclear weapons, as a way of basically bankrupting the supposed enemy, the Soviet Union. And it was considered a very dangerous kind of policy. It was going to increase weapons building all across the whole conflict. And so I thought, and I had used the Bishop's, not Bishop's, but the just war theory statement to examine this. But now when I read this, the chapter 7, I've gotten a different angle on this. I'd like to just present it something more format. That's simply this, that what struck me was two things. The just war theory is an approach that's really very much outdated now, largely considered to be outdated because it's the condition that war takes place nowadays, and the size or the scope of war is so enormous and so destructive that it's very difficult to think of any kind of war as being justifiable under this theory, because the theory says that that you have to, if you're going to consider going to war and you're head of state, you have to have fulfilled yourself certain conditions like proportionality, that the weapons you use aren't going to be destroying too many people. And you have to have a really good reason for going to war. A number of things like this, which have become largely irrelevant, I think, especially in light of the fact that war today is carried out in such gargantuan proportions with nuclear weapons and cyber weapons and all kinds of other things as well. And so that's become kind of irrelevant. I don't think anyone takes it very seriously, and the Pope himself has said that he doesn't take it very seriously anymore either. So what does that leave us with? And I think what he's done is very good, because he's focused on something. If just having a set of criteria that you have to fulfill in order to go to war, if that doesn't work, because people aren't going to restrain themselves if they go to war, they're going to go to war to win, and they're going to attempt to destroy the enemy, no matter what it costs, then that's not going to work to just have a certain set of artificial criteria that really come from the late Middle Ages, you know. And so that's been largely poo-pooed now. No one takes it very seriously. But there's something else I think that he mentions in the chapter 7 that I found very compelling, because I do most of my research now on the conflict in Northern Ireland and the conflict supposedly between Protestants and Catholics, but it's really between Protestants and Catholics, and England, of course, is a participant as well. And I'd like to just talk about that a bit, because I was so struck by his, let me just read a brief passage here. If this is on paragraph number 229, at the end he says, as the bishops, at the end of the paragraph, as the bishops of South Korea pointed out, true peace can be achieved only when we strive for justice through dialogue, pursuing reconciliation and mutual development. Again, through dialogue, pursuing reconciliation and mutual development. And I was just struck by this because what I do in Northern Ireland is basically I interview people who are former members of the IRA or former members of Protestant equivalent like UDA and UVF, that is guerrilla fighters who have been attempting to win their war militarily through guerrilla warfare largely and other means. But there have been people now, a number of people who have just simply decided out of sheer exhaustion, I think, that this method of trying to achieve your objectives, however justifiably your objectives seem to you, is not really working anymore. And there's people on each side have said to me when I'm over there, there has to be another way. That's what we decided, there just has to be another way. And what they've done there is the following. A number of people have come together in neighborhoods. See, in Northern Ireland, Belfast, the neighborhoods are very much segregated. Protestants live in one neighborhood, Catholics in another neighborhood. And these neighborhoods border each other very closely. And there's always a border between the two, a main drag or something rather that constitutes a border. And that's what no one is willing to cross at all. And so these peoples, the Protestants and Catholics in the North, have lived this way for many years, entirely without any contact with each other. I mean, I've spoken to a number of young people who said, well, I wouldn't go over there because you never know what'll happen to me. Some IRA guy will get me, or some UDA guy will get me or shoot me up or whatever. And so that's all disappeared. Now, what's happened since this time is the following. What I've been following myself over there is interviewing people who have decided that the conflict is so ruinous to their neighborhood in terms of the schooling, in terms of youth, in terms of the economy, in terms of housing, in terms of almost everything. It's so ruinous that they have to find some way of handling it. But they can't handle it by themselves. They can only handle it by working with people from the other community right across the road, what's called the interface between the two neighborhoods. So that's what goes on now. Now, what's happened since that time is people from the IRA from one neighborhood and people from the UDA or the UVF Protestant groups in another neighborhood will come together and have meetings and trying to figure out how to handle a particular problem that both neighborhoods have in common. It might be youth, juvenile delinquency, we would call it juvenile delinquency, or it could be crime and need for better police protection. It could be housing problems, could be employment problems. All these are problems that both sides share, really, because they're both working class communities. And what has happened, in short, a few years, about the past 10 years or so, there are members now of the IRA who are working with members of the UDA, the UVF, Protestant paramilitary groups. People who've been trying to kill each other for years are now literally working together. And you ask them, well, how did you do this? How did you come together? Independent of each other, they'll always say to me, well, things are getting so terrible here. You had to do something. We had to find another way of living. And so we had to connect with these other guys over there and see what they could do. Well, what they found out is by working together on a mutual problem that both sides feel very strongly about, they found out that what they share is exactly the same conditions, the same economic conditions, and therefore the same environmental conditions, same psychological condition. They found out that they're exactly the same. And I remember one teenager I talked to over there said to me, he said, I was just so shocked. He said, you're just like us, just like us. And this has been the case with the adults people too, IRA people and community organizers on both sides. We've never had any contact whatsoever with people on the other side. We're just afraid. You just never entered that neighborhood. You never crossed that interface to get into that neighborhood because you didn't know what would happen. When they have found this, when they started working together, and they've had this big push to work together because if you didn't get something done, the neighborhood was going to get worse and worse, and it was going to be more juvenile delinquency and more job problems and more education problems, more school problems and like. If you didn't do it, things would get worse. So therefore, you were compelled to do it. But the interesting thing about the compulsion aspect is it has forced them to recognize a common humanity, which has simply never existed before. Such a shock. And I don't know I can't tell you how many different people I've talked to who've been engaged in this community organizing is. They have found out that they're just so shocked to find out the people on this other side of this interface, the other neighborhood, are just like them. And I thought, well, it couldn't be. They couldn't have really thought that these other people weren't like that. they're just exaggerating, being a little rhetorical. Well, they weren't being rhetorical. They weren't exaggerating. That's exactly how they felt. You could not deal with Catholics because they would try to bring their church involved. They would try to control your thinking. You couldn't deal with Protestants because they weren't willing to let you get a job in the government or get a job for you. So you couldn't deal with them at all. You just couldn't deal with them. They were impossible. You decide. Well, they decided. What they found out was once you started to have this problem, the same problems, and these problems were serious problems, then you had to deal with each other. Then you find out ways of coping. And so what they've done now in so many different places, I researched this book I'm trying to finish up now, about 9 or 10 different cases of this kind of neighborhood community organizing work between Protestants and Catholics along interfaces, which has really been very compelling. But the only problem they're now having is some politicians, particularly on the Protestant side, are so worried that they're going to be losing control over Protestant voters. When they usually just tell them, go out and vote this way, and everything. And make sure you don't vote for any Catholics because if you do that, we're going to get into real problems. You don't want to vote any Catholics into office because if you vote a Catholic into office, that will mean that you're going to have Sinn Féin, which is the party of Irish, bringing together both sides, North and South of Ireland together, and all of that. So this is the real issue, and it's what's happened is now. Let me just finish up because I think I'm taking too much time here. Let me just finish up by pointing out that what these groups have done is create more political change, not yet in parties, but some in parties, but political change in terms of what has to happen before political parties and people in government bring about change, which is change in communities. That more and more people in communities are now beginning to recognize in the Protestant side, well, Catholics aren't so bad because we found out this guy is going to do this for us and that, and he's coming over here and he's working with our guy and this and that and the other thing. Same thing on the other side. So this is what's going to change the whole deal. It's going to take time, but it's the one solution to what was otherwise seen as an absolutely interminable problem that you could never deal with, this ultimate hatred between two groups. It's only been broken down by people having to face very similar, in fact, identical problems, and then sending leaders together from each community to work on these problems, and then bringing these issues back to the community and saying, this is what we negotiated here, this is what we negotiated there, what do you think of this, what do you think of that? And it's just been enormously effective. They're not so much published yet, because politicians like to have their own, control of what everybody says about politics in the North. But it's really happening much more so. I think the big change is really on the Protestants who are having to cope with the fact that they now have to see Catholics as a positive element, whereas Catholics have long since been perfectly willing to work with Protestants as Protestants. Now it's beginning to happen, I think. So maybe I should stop here, Paul, and let you go on, because I'm afraid I'm taking about 10 or 15 minutes already. So.
Well, thank you, Kevin. We'll be coming back to you in a short while anyway. That was very helpful because I don't know, everybody listening, what Kevin Cassidy just described in the Northern Ireland situation is exactly the kind of thing that the Pope is talking about in this chapter, that he is interested in. He doesn't spend a long time debating the evils of war. He spends a lot of time unpacking how we achieve truth and reconciliation. He has a big section on memory and how memories can be used to heal. He talks about truth and reconciliation committees around the world, in South Africa, in Rwanda, perhaps in Northern Ireland, lots of places. The one thing that I think, the one extra takeaway there might be for us is to think about what Professor Cassidy just said and ask ourselves if this does not actually have an application in our own world, in our own national culture, with its dramatic differences of opinion. And you see on the one hand, you see white supremacists, many of whom come from rural white backgrounds, and they see as their enemies often the Black community. And you ask yourself, well, how are these different groups affected by life in American culture? And very often they have very similar needs, very similar privation. So the conditions might be there for something like the Northern Ireland experiment here, and maybe we'll get to talk to Professor Cassidy about that in a little while. So one more thought there in this section that does bring us to the United States, which is where I'm going to focus with my few minutes on the death penalty. And that is that one of the things the Pope is extremely determined to speak strongly against is the arms trade. Any of you who saw, and if you didn't, you should, any of you who saw the Pope's speech before the joint session of Congress 4 years or so back when he came to the United States might remember that he was interrupted frequently by both sides of the House and both sides of the Senate standing up and applauding him for one remark or another. Like, you know, we're all immigrants here. Yes, everybody applauds. And then he gets to the arms trade and he talks about the evils of the arms trade. And the place went deathly quiet because he was talking about the evils that perpetuate wars around the world, for which our nation, a principal arms dealer, is partly responsible. So there is a sense in his discussion of war, peace, and the arms trade where, I mean, he's addressing global issues, but he is also pressing a button to bother us, particularly on the arms trade. Now, when it comes to the death penalty, it's even more a matter of addressing us directly. His discussion of the death penalty is fairly short, and in some of the comments he makes, he's obviously thinking about extrajudicial executions, which used to happen here in distressingly large numbers where they were called lynchings, and still happen around the world in many different places. Here, they're not so much extrajudicial executions, but they are judicial executions. Now, the recent history of the Catholic Church's teaching on the death penalty has been that it is less and less acceptable from a Catholic perspective for several reasons that I will mention briefly in a minute. I want to read to you just 6 lines from the Pope's letter where he introduces this topic, and then we'll talk about some of the things he uses to explain his position. So this is, if anybody who needs to know, this is at section 263 in Fratelli Tutti. He says this. He's just finished talking about war, peace, reconciliation. He says, there is yet another way to eliminate others. One aimed not at countries, but at individuals. It is the death penalty. Saint John Paul II stated clearly and firmly that the death penalty is inadequate from a moral standpoint and no longer necessary from that of penal justice. Then the Pope says, there can be no stepping back from this position. Today, we state clearly that the death penalty is inadmissible, and the Church is firmly committed to calling for its abolition worldwide. And as many of you may know, in so-called developed countries, the United States is really the only country that permits, even in some states, encourages judicial executions. So this is addressed to 2 groups of people. This is addressed to the lawless who perpetuate extrajudicial executions, and to the United States. There are many arguments used to justify a death penalty, some better than others. So the argument that, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is really relatively easy to dismiss from a Christian perspective anyway. The argument that this is rehabilitation is clearly not accurate, because you don't rehabilitate a dead person. The perspective on the death penalty has to be understood as a problem from the frequency of judicial errors, and, as you may know, the racial makeup of those who are convicted and subjected to the death penalty. It's way more like, if you commit a murder, you'd better be white. You have a much better chance of not receiving the death penalty. But the argument that the Pope wants to present to us for the abolition of the death penalty is not simply, well, it's vengeance, or it's cruel and unusual punishment, or it can be unfair because of judicial errors. I mean, he accepts all those things. His argument is basically, we have no right to take a life. Life is sacred. We've all heard about the right to life in the Catholic tradition. And those of us who pay attention closely know that the right to life is way more comprehensive than the issue of pro-life or pro-choice, or the issue of so-called mercy killing. It extends right across human experience. The right to life is invoked when thousands of children are dying every day because they don't have medicines that we could get to them, or because they are malnourished, and so on and so on and so on. And the right to life is about this fundamental principle of Catholic social teaching, that we all have equal dignity and equal human rights, whatever our circumstances, and frankly, whatever we've done. So what the Pope wants us to see here is that, and this has gone through the whole letter, what the Pope wants us to see here is that the way we deal with, the way we live within a culture that has legal execution is destructive to some degree of our humanity. So let me finish by just throwing out a few quick questions for you. You may or may not want to respond to them. But I would say first, what does this papal teaching suggest to us about US foreign policy with our support for, let's say, our support for the Saudi Arabian attacks on the Yemen? Or what does papal teaching suggest to us about US policy on the death penalty? What should we be doing to encourage President Biden to abolish the federal death penalty? Second issue, what are the issues that are raised for us? This is a slightly bit different, but what are the issues raised for us by President Biden's announcement today that the US is withdrawing from Afghanistan, ending a US war, but leaving the Afghanis to their fate? Very difficult question. Should he abolish the federal death penalty? A lot of people think he should. What about the issue that a lot of people will raise is, well, we don't need to have the death penalty. We can have life without parole. Well, according to Pope Francis, life without parole is a living death sentence. And that's not a good thing. And then finally, is it correct that our policies in the United States and our practices on war, the arms trade, the death penalty, is it correct that they express and contribute to the violence that is such a part of our culture? And would it, if we address those issues, would it lead us to more, to impetus towards more reconciliation, more forgiveness, more peace? Would addressing these issues in the light of Pope Francis's teaching, would it really materially contribute to transforming us into a more just and peaceful society? Is there a relationship between a society that turns a blind eye to making money out of the arms trade, that turns a blind eye to death row and the people who are sometimes executed on death row, and that, if it doesn't turn a blind eye, soon forgets the latest spree of the killing of senseless people wherever they are in the United States? So there's a lot of issues raised here. And, we might say, we might think the Pope's teaching is very, very idealistic. We should view our political opponents in the same way we view our children. But he's taking the long view of the price for the human community of letting these kinds of practices continue. So that's all I'm going to say for now. And so we can now, Kevin Cassidy and I can now be up on the screen together. And I'm going to start by reading a question for Professor Cassidy from Father Tom Massaro at Fordham, who actually knows a great deal more about Catholic social teaching, certainly than I do. And this is his question for Kevin. He says, so you're listening, Kevin, or maybe you can see it. It sounds like the Northern Ireland example is confirming a certain insight I have heard several times from peacemakers like Archbishop Desmond Tutu. That insight is that progress toward peace is a function of having a healthy moral imagination. In other words, the ability to imagine a future world that is built on the foundation of ideas and commitments that are substantially different from what we knew in the past. So, does this capture your experience in Northern Ireland?
Yes, I think it does. I haven't thought of it in those terms, but I think it does, because people I've talked to who just had no use whatsoever for people who lived on the other side of the interface, under this other group, Protestant or Catholics, whatever it was. They had no use for them whatsoever, then have become, just turned themselves around. It's just so powerful experience. Because they turn themselves around just by having to deal with the other side. And the other side, when they learn the other side has exactly the same problems as they do, and they can't get over that they're the same kinds of people, that then they start to entertain an alternative, whatever you want to call it, alternative universe, alternative way of building a society, That's what's so strange. And I think in a way, their difficulty now is among these local community leaders is they'll have people in their community who terribly resent them. Let's say a Irish Republican saying, well, how can you possibly deal with these crazy Protestants? They've been shooting us, they've been trying to kill us, they've been preventing us from doing anything whatsoever, getting employment whatsoever. How can you deal with them as equals here? And he said, well, this is, they have to deal with, this is the only way we can get anything done here. But it's just so striking to me how some people, when they have this experience of the other, direct personal experience of the other, one-on-one, and then they work these things out, how that's what makes the difference, as opposed to someone living in a community who's reasonable, etc., and can't possibly entertain working with these crazies on the other side. It's just, you have to have this, apparently this experience of, your experience of this other person and where he's coming from. I've had one guy said to me, look, this is a Protestant paramilitary leader, who's been in and out of jail for many years and killed lots of people. And he said, look, what I found out when I met these IRA guys finally, and we had these discussions, he said, I found out that, what, once you, how do you put it? Once you understand a person and you come to know him, you can't kill him. That's what he said. That was it. That was it. That's the whole point. So that's why I would agree with your questioner from Fordham there, Father Massaro. I think he's right on it. It is, but it has to be that this doesn't come in any theoretical way, this alternative way of thinking about society. It comes out of an experience that you have with another person. parent enemy, when you experience that other person, that's when this other alternative way of thinking comes into focus.
Yeah. It's an illustration, isn't it, of that old principle that ignorance causes fear, that we're
Oh,
afraid of what
yes.
we don't know.
Oh,
And if we
absolutely.
had a little more acquaintance, so whether it's in Northern Ireland or if 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 racial divides were not as strong here as they are, if people were not effectively ghettoized in different communities, that
Right.
we might have a better chance of we would have a better chance of knowing one another, and there will be less fear.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's what has to happen. I used to think of that as being kind of, airy-fairy, local, get all these people together, make noise and everything. Well, it's not so airy-fairy. It's essential. It has to happen. People have to come to know each other if there's going to be any change. If there's not going to be any change without it. You know. They have to be dealing with an important issue. It's something really important to them. Could be schools, like how we're going to integrate the schools, or how we're going to deal with COVID, or how we're going to deal with this, that, the other thing. You have to deal with each other on what your kids are going to be subjected to, or my kids are going to be subjected to, how we're going to arrange the school system, or how we're going to deal with housing problems. When you start to deal with that stuff, then you start to recognize the person's humanity, because he's got his own issues, and they're just like crazy as your issues.
Yeah. So second question here, which is, I wouldn't call it a question, I would call it a corrective to what I said, and an important one. So Emily Tukolsky says, can we acknowledge the extrajudicial killings still happening in the United States? Just this past week of Dante Wright, only one of many killed extrajudicially by police in the United States. And, I think if I gave the impression that we have judicial execution here and all extrajudicial executions are happening, somewhere else, that was quite wrong, because clearly one can't answer for any specific case, but given the number of dead people as a consequence of their interaction with law enforcement, I think those are definitely, in many cases, extrajudicial executions. So Emily, I don't know you, but I thank you for pointing that out. I think that's an important thing to bear
Yeah.
in mind.
Can I make a point?
Go ahead, Kevin.
Sure. I think what's been so striking to me, anyway, is that now it's this technology that has made this truth that she's pointing out available to us. In other words, that high school girl who was taking the picture of George Floyd, who was being, killed by Chauvin, the officer. That was her, little camera on her phone. And we got the same thing with last night with the Dante, what's his last name? Sorry, Wright.
Dante
There
Wright.
was a little camera, on the officer's hat, and that caught that thing too. That this officer pulls out saying she's going to tase this guy, taser him, and then shoots him instead. And you're supposed to. We have to believe that she didn't understand the difference between a taser gun and a fully armed, fully weaponized police weapon gun. Somehow or other. This is all these things are coming out now, which never would have happened without the technology. This technology in the past would have been, would have been he said, she said thing. This is what the officer said. This is what the supposed criminal said. And you always generally tend to think the officer is probably correct. And now it turns out that now we're finding out the truth is that there are these extrajudicial killings going on, and they go on a regular basis. And some police officers are just, as we say, taking the law into their own hands, which is to say, making it extrajudicial.
Right.
It's
So
just,
now,
go ahead.
well, I've got another question for you, right?
Yes.
Northern Ireland question, and it's one I was certainly thinking about as you were talking. So this is from John O'Donoghue. He says, recently we've seen a significant rise in violence in some Northern Irish neighborhoods, particularly loyalist ones. The immediate causes seem to be related to the COVID restrictions and the new Brexit border in the Irish Sea. It appears that much of the rioting is by young people who are being coached by older people from their community. So he says, I would like your view on this recent disturbing development and how it might be addressed, particularly by religious leaders.
Well, the religious leaders aren't much over there. They haven't done much. I mean, at least in my experience. So I would like them to do something to that effect, but they haven't. I remember one time, my first time I went to Northern Ireland, I went with a study group from over here, and we went, and the Catholic bishop and found the community now where it was, but it was a major diocese, and we went, and he was out at a meeting someplace, so he had his two chief assistants, two major, curates in the diocese, and all they could talk about was very much parochial stuff, school systems and churches and stuff. They couldn't relate to this whole conflict, tearing their whole community apart. So I don't expect much from it. And there have been, of course, very exceptional individuals who have responded, but they're not generally. But anyway, about the Brexit business, yeah, I think that's what my understanding is exactly what the questioner just brought up. In other words, that this is a result of the Brexit thing, and largely, and what was so striking to me, one reporter said in talking to people, loyalist types, that's militant Protestants, we use the term loyalist, was that they were so concerned that the agreement that had been worked out with the British about borders and about when you have to have a border control system, when on the country goods can be transferred across borders without any problems whatsoever. And what the real problem for these loyalists was, it was now apparent that they were, because of these various compromises that had been made to work out some decent settlement where everybody would be happy. What had happened was that now the Northern Ireland was no longer being connected in the same way to England, and therefore was no longer being thought of as being part of the British Isles because of this trade relationship. Now, this was nothing judicial, this is just economic, but they were so freaked out, these militant Protestants, that any type of breakdown in the connection between Northern Ireland and England had to be opposed in any way. Even if it was going to help economics and everything else, they had to oppose it, because what this would do is weaken Northern Ireland's identity with as part of the British Empire, and then it would therefore be sliding into this relationship with the South and then Ireland, which is what they're so desperately opposed to. So this was the Brexit thing is a big problem, because they've tried. Everybody has tried. Every time I talk to anybody over there about what's happening with Brexit, I call some friends or something, I always say, we don't know yet, and everybody's been trying very hard to work these things out with politicians and the like, but they still have not been able to figure out something that makes it possible for goods to travel back and forth, and yet not somehow going to question the validity of the political arrangements that have been there since the beginning of the 20th century, 1914, 1918 stuff. So that the existence of Northern Ireland is seen as being so vitally important to these people, they will stand on that, even though economically they're suffering from it. And that's really crazy. That's the Protestant position, at least that some Protestants anyway. Their position is, we have to maintain this our unity with England, and that's what makes Northern Ireland, and that's what makes it a separate country from the South. And even if we're not going to be in trouble economically from this problem, well, you just have to put up with it for a while. That's their view. It's a very strange view. I mean, because you're going to be losing a great deal economically. So that's what the questioner who just sent in this question was referring to, and I think it's correct. He's right. It's a big problem, but the big problem is the loyalists are desperate. See, they're really desperate. It's like southern U.S. Any type of change, wow, the blacks are getting everything. Any type of change in the South, since the 1960s, and civil rights movement was blacks are getting everything. They're getting everything. Well, this idea with loyalists is Catholics are getting everything because they're going to destroy this connection we have with England, and therefore they're going to get us all into the South. See.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know if that's clear or not. I'm making it clear or not.
It
right.
pursue it furthers the conversation. It gets people thinking. So Alyssa Profanato asked a question about a remark I made. She says, why is life without parole the same thing as the death penalty? Well, I guess you'd probably have to ask the person who has been subjected to life without parole. But this is what the Pope says. It's in section 268. He says, he's talking about prison reform in general. And he says all Christians and people of goodwill should be working today, not just for the abolition of the death penalty, legal or illegal, but also to work for the improvement of prison conditions out of respect for the human dignity of persons deprived of their freedom. And then he adds, I would link this to life imprisonment. A life sentence is a secret death penalty. And, it's like being, the way I would think of it is it's sort of like being buried alive with oxygen. You're never going to get out. I think that's what he's thinking of. Do you want to say anything, Kevin, about that?
Well, no, I was just thinking there's a movie called, a documentary called Where Should We Invade Next by, what's his name? The director of, who did all those great movies on Roger and Me and about the automobile industry, you know what I mean? He does all these wonderful social criticism type of movies. He went around and he said he went around to interview people in mostly Western Europe and Scandinavian countries and Italy and a number of other countries. And he asked them, why they wanted to come to the US. And what he found out was they had very distorted views of the US, was very Pollyanna views of the U.S. And what he found out in particular about imprisonment, he went to Norway, I think it was, and he talked to prisoners in Norway. And prisoners in Norway, unless you're really a very dangerous person, you're there in this prison, but it's mostly like a cottage system. And then you go out and you go to your training job and you come back at night, and then you go out the next day and you're trained into a job that'll get you into mainstream society. And then when you're ready to leave, you leave. And so that's how it is there. And they were so struck by the fact that you would have to be locked up in a maximum security thing in the United States, and that was not the case there. What was going on in the prison system there is it's really very much rehabilitation system. We never really embraced rehabilitation, I don't think, at all.
Yeah. I could take a quick question here from another of my students. Libby Kinsella wants to know, what do you think Pope Francis's response will be to the recent news on the shooting of Dante Wright? And, this is not meant to be a glib answer, Libby, but I would say he probably would shed a tear or two, because it is one more sign of it doesn't matter, you don't have to take sides here, although it's pretty obvious which side you might want to take. But the whole situation there is an evidence of the dysfunctionality of the relationship between our police forces and the communities that they are created to serve. And there's stress, and there's violence, and there's tragedy on both sides. And this was clearly a very, very tragic event. And I'm sure the Pope would have been is probably deeply disturbed by it. Now, Kevin, a question from Eula Valdez, another of my students. So,
yes.
Hello, Dr. Cassidy. This question is not related to Northern Ireland, but I'm wondering if you've heard about the Philippines' war on drugs under President Duterte. Most of the people targeted are from poor communities. I want to know your thoughts on it, especially because the Philippines is predominantly a Catholic country.
I'm afraid I don't know anything really about it. I've heard about that. It just strikes me when it's focusing on these poor communities, that the poor communities are invariably not the people who are self-contained in terms of the drug industry. They're not getting the drugs and consuming them themselves. They're selling them to other people, and therefore other people want them. So other people in other classes, other parts of the country are indeed, fostering this drug trade. from which the poor will be blamed and be locked up or whatever. That's all I could think of to say. But I don't really know much more about it specifically than that. That's often the case. That's the drug trade in the U.S. for a very long time. It's been exactly that situation.
Yeah, I think we do know that President Duterte is a little bit more involved with the drug trade than our presidents are. He's a despicable human being, pretty clearly, which certainly doesn't help. But like Kevin, I don't really know what the Philippines church is saying about this, but I do know that historically, the church in the Philippines has been extremely proactive about defending the rights of the poor. So we should look more into that.
Yes.
Yeah, you could report on that next week in class if you like. Find out and let us know. So we have a couple more questions and then we'll wrap it up. So the next one I think I'll take, and then I'll leave the last one for Kevin because it's the most difficult. So the next one is, so how to deal with unjust aggressors. So John Sullivan saying, is there not a right to self-defense? Might Pope Francis be a little too idealistic to treat all our enemies as our children? When children misbehave, are there not consequences to their actions? Yes, exactly so. And there's a section in this chapter, John, that is headed forgiving, but not forgetting. And in this section, he says, that forgiveness does not mean impunity. And then he says this, he says, justice is properly sought solely out of love of justice itself, out of respect for the victims, as a means of preventing new crimes and protecting the common good, not as an alleged outlet for personal anger. So it's once again, it's this what we are seeking is the health of society. The health of society might very well require punishment for offenders, but it doesn't require hate. So look up that section, John Sullivan.
Yeah, there's a procedure that they use in Northern Ireland and now a number of other countries as well. I forgot the name of it, but I think it's called reconciliation justice, something to the effect where, let's say, I spoke to one community organizer when I first went over there. This is about 10 years ago, and he said, "Well, here's how it works. Some kid comes along, and let's say he breaks the windows in a car or something like that, or smashes the windows in a house, or just something like that. So what happens? They arrest the kid. He's brought to meet with the people who own the car or own the house, and they have to work out some relationship where he is going to either, get money to pay him back for that car problem or the house window broken, and so it's worked out between the victim and the perpetrator, and the victim the perpetrator has to handle the damage he created, whatever it happens to be. And then it's really about, what the Pope says, about justice rather than about some kind of revenge. It's just getting everything handled.
So when people cause damage in the dorms, they shouldn't just be fined. They should actually be made to come in with paint and wallpaper and plaster and fix the job, huh?
Well,
all right, last question for today. I'm being a bit unfair, Kevin, saying I'll handle it to you. Maybe we'll both tackle this. So here's the last question from Marilyn Lorenz. I love Fratelli Tutti, but how do we get an overwhelming majority of US Catholics to apply it? And I'm sure she's thinking that, well, of course, half of US Catholics, according to most of the surveys, support the death penalty. It's changing a bit, but it's still moving in that direction. And it is true that in the last election, half of American Catholics voted for Donald Trump, which means presumably half of American Catholics do not want immigrants, or at least don't want illegal immigrants, certainly don't want refugees. And half of them were quite comfortable with the president's decision to begin federal executions again, and so on. So we do have a divided community. So Kevin, what do we do about it?
Well, I have two thoughts just off the top of my head, very much off the top of my head. One is, I think if you're going to get any type of change from Catholics, you're going to have to get some change in what's preached from a pulpit. In other words, if the clergy are as conservative a group as they seem to have been, the most, clergy since, well, since the civil rights movement, really, American clergy have been very conservative generally, and the most conservative ones are the most young ones, and they're the people who are most compatible with this type of racist stuff and authoritarianism. And so, unless you can somehow change these education, clerical education somehow, and get these people to recognize what their obligation is as leaders of the Christian community, then it's never going to change. The other thing is looking at it from the other end. As a community, someone who's done some community organizing for now and then, I really feel that it's just about going out. Well, I've been active in Bridgeport a number of different areas over the years, some election campaigns, some other local community campaigns on different issues. What you do is you go out door to door, you get some other people with you, and you go out and you talk to people about the issue, and you call a meeting, and then you get more and more people come to a meeting, and then they get another meeting, and you just generate information for people, and you tell people, look, this is what's going on. This is a real problem in the community. This racist stuff that's happening in some particular issue, some particular area. And then you try to get people going. And then what happens is eventually someone, hopefully from the church, will say, well, why don't you come in and give us a talk about this or something like that. That's how it usually happens. I mean, in America, things can really get changed very rapidly, but it has to be done very informally. You know, in some European countries, political party would be responsive right away to this issue and they'd want to take it up. But in America, it doesn't happen, but it does happen in a very free and unrestricted way in terms of community organizers and community organizers who, I mean, I did this with the nuclear arms race issue back in the 80s. We were trying to get Reagan to stop building more and more nuclear weapons. We started this nuclear freeze movement, which really did affect very much the nuclear weapons policy of the U.S. But this was because we went neighborhood door to door and talked to people about what was going to happen if we kept building more and more nuclear weapons. It's craziness. Then I got invited to come and speak in a number of churches as well as community organizations, stuff like that. So that's how it happens, I think, in an informal way. But I sure as hell like to see clergy re-educated on this in seminaries, what the issues really are in seminaries. That would be helpful. That's my 2 cents. Paul. How about you? I'd like to curious about what you're going to say.
You know, I don't want to put too much emphasis on the clergy. I'm not saying that I don't think that they are, I don't think that they're conservative so much as that they're timid. I think the bishops are very conservative. I think the clergy are probably no more nor less conservative than the Catholic population as a whole, but I do think they tend to be timid. The solution lies with us, right? So it's probably what something of what you're saying, Kevin, that the solution lies with us. And I've always thought the solution to church problems lies in the local parish. And the local parish is not the personal possession of the pastor. It's the community of the people, mostly lay, who have a responsibility to educate themselves and one another and to take stands on things. And if we are just passive, or if we have a church where we encourage passivity, which is still too often the case, much is not going to happen.
Right. But didn't you get some examples like St. Anthony's, church where they've been open to much greater participation by laity and eventually possibly something more broad-based,
Yeah.
issues.
Yeah. Kevin, Professor Cassidy's talking about St. Anthony of Padua in Fairfield, which is a church that he and I both attend, and it's an unusual place, led by a lay woman. And there are many others like it around the country, but there aren't enough.
Yes, exactly.
So we're going to draw this to an end now. We don't have another question, but we do have a remark, which I think is a very good one. So an anonymous attendee listening to us answering this last question said, read Joan Chittister and her book, The Time Is Now. And if you don't know the name, you younger people, Sister Joan Chittister is a Benedictine sister and a terrific writer and a wonderful presence. If you ever get a chance to hear her, go and hear her. And probably we should be reading Joan Chittister. She is a woman without fear.
Yes, exactly.
So usually at this moment in the event, I take a moment to announce the next event in our program. But there aren't any more, right? The next, my light just went out. There we go. The next event in our program will be in the fall. And in the fall, we will have 3 major lectures. We'll have Christina Trainer from Fordham doing the O'Callaghan Lecture on Women in Church and Society. We will have the chorus master from the historically Black college, Spelman College, coming to talk about how you use the Black musical tradition for Catholic liturgical music. And we will also have the shortly to retire president of the Greater Bridgeport Council of Churches, Cass Shaw. So there'll be the 3 people who speak in the fall. We'll also have 3 living theology sessions yet to be arranged. One last thing, which is that if you want to look at this talk again, or if you missed any of the others this semester, if you go to the website where you registered for this and click on the archives button, you can find all our presentations for this. You can find all our presentations for the past 16 years, actually, but you can find all the presentations from this past semester. And I hope you will fill in the ones that you missed. So thank yous, the usual thank yous to Anthony for working in the background and making sure this whole thing went well. Thank you for Mary Crimmins for helping us out with setting up the mechanics for this program. And thank you for the work that you put into this, Kevin, to put this whole, I was trying to read extra questions, but there aren't any that matter. So finally then, thank you, Kevin Cassidy, for doing this for us. And thank you, all of you, for being here. We look forward to seeing you in the fall.